BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Black Box Ned 88 on Instagram TV for the bonus podcast. And today we're revisiting the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, a case which needs no introduction because it is perhaps the most famous missing persons case in the world. Very specifically today, we're going to talk about the theory of Thomas Henry Horan in this one, and the nutshell version of that is that it is a sting operation. It was a sting operation that backfired, and there were a couple reasons why they had to turn this into the media event that it was. But we are going back to May 3rd of 2007 to talk all about Madeleine McCann. First and foremost, I should say that Thomas Horan is perhaps more famous for being involved with the myth of the Zodiac Killer, the Great Zodiac Killer hoax, as well as the novel Gemini Tiger. But right now, what I would like to do is just to have Thomas Horan say this in his own words. We're going to play a clip. It's a rather lengthy clip, but then we will have a bit of a discussion.
Autopsy report. How convincing is it? You know, the thing, right? Hitler, right? Okay, well, that's interesting because I can prove she's not dead. Well, I can prove that there isn't any evidence that she's dead, and there's no reason to think she's dead. It's going to be a while. Here's the thing about Madeleine McCann. She's still 17 years old. In the Commonwealth, they have laws about protecting the privacy of children. I may be able to make the case that next year when she's 18, she's a public figure. And I'm not trying to. Here's the thing. You got to understand, her mother had no idea, not at the time. I'm sure she knows now, because this family that Madeleine lives with, they traveled back to the UK a few years ago, and they were staying in a city less than an hour away from Gerald and Kate. I'm pretty sure Kate's been allowed to visit her. But you got to understand, her father sold her to the gypsies, and I'm not joking. Her father sold her to the gypsies. He just didn't realize that the gypsies he was selling, because he doesn't think Madeleine's his daughter. See, all those kids are artificial insemination babies, and he got it in his head, maybe she didn't look like him or something, that Kate had an affair, and she probably did, and that Madeleine was not his biological child. He was smart enough to know he couldn't get away with murder, and maybe didn't want to murder her, so he made arrangements to sell her to the gypsies on the dark web. And they went to Praia de Luz to meet these people. And he's guilty as hell. I can prove that. The only person in the whole world, right? But he had to have accomplices, and guess what? Four of the most important people in the whole cracking down on child trafficking in England were staying in the same apartment building, and blah, blah, and they have no alibis and blah, 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 blah. I can tell you minute by minute, I can tell you how he planned it, and he planned this months in advance. And I can tell you who he was making contact with on the dark web, and I can tell you who showed up, and I can tell you what time he opened that window, and I can tell you who reached in that window, and either he handed Madeleine out the window or he left her on that extra bed underneath the window. Either way. But see, the accomplice was too short to reach up and pull the shutter back down. And he saw that, and he tried to pull it down, and it jammed on him. And there was nothing he could do, et cetera, et cetera. And I can tell you exactly who they handed her. I can tell you exactly. I mean, it was very well planned, and that was their downfall. It was too well planned. It was perfectly planned and perfectly executed, except for one thing. Right, so looking at all this, and then it was obvious, and then I did a little snooping, and there she was.
Okay, and those were the words of Thomas Henry Horan, and if anyone would like to hear that full episode, he does number his episodes. This is from his live stream, and it's Season 2, Episode 24, and his show is called The Stones Unturned Podcast. Once again, Season 2, Episode 24, there's an SO2E24 in the title, so you can find that if you'd like to hear the whole episode. His stuff on Madeleine McCann starts about 2 hours into the live stream. It's a 3-hour live stream, just in case anyone wants to hear more about this one. Okay, so what do we make of this? First and foremost, I mean, in case you didn't catch it there, it was a sting operation. And I've heard him talk about this in the past, and we were even trying once to get Thomas Horan to come on the show to talk about Madeleine McCann. We did one interview with him about the Zodiac Killer, and, of course, some things weren't able to match up in terms of the time frame. But what I would say is that originally I thought he was going to say something to the effect of the sting operation theory would be that Jerry and Kate were, well, not exactly working together, but I mean, you kind of heard him there. He said that Kate McCann would not have had any knowledge of this, but I thought it was going to be something to the effect of Jerry McCann was working as a confidential informant, and they were using Madeleine as the bait in a sting operation to try and catch some pedophiles. But it turns out that that isn't what happened. As you heard him say right there, there was a plot from Jerry McCann to sell Madeleine to these people that we could call them the Roma people, we could call them the gypsies. For a while, the term gypsy was supposed to be something that was, like kind of a slur that we weren't supposed to say. So the word that we were supposed to use was Roma, but then no one would ever know what we were talking about. So we went back to saying gypsies. But yeah, the Roma people from Albania, and these are very specifically Greek Roma gypsies from Albania, and they were involved with the dark web, child trafficking, and Jerry had this plan to sell Madeleine to someone from that network. According to Thomas Horan, this network of Greek Roma Albanians is involved in child trafficking all across Europe. And to the credit of the Netflix docuseries, The Disappearance of Madeleine McCann, they did say very clearly that these child trafficking networks exist, and the dark web has all types of child trafficking networks. It is something that is very real. But you heard Thomas Horan saying there all these things. He can tell you what happens, but he's waiting. He can tell you what happens, but he's not going to just yet. And I would also just like to do this one and be very clear that it is the year 2020 right now. And he says that on May 12th of 2021, he will be able to reveal the location of where Madeleine McCann has been living and talk about how this whole thing came to fruition. But once again, we would have to wait until May 12th and of 2021 because then Madeleine would turn 18, and presently she is still a minor. What do we make of the sting operation theory? I would have to say, first and foremost, if I had brought Thomas Horan onto this program to talk about Madeleine McCann, I would have sat patiently listening to him lay that out step by step, as opposed to the only thing that I could genuinely contribute, which would just be voicing my frustrations about how the media was just spreading all sorts of different things. I have to tell you, when we started talking about Madeleine McCann here on this channel back in 2018, and we don't regularly talk about Madeleine McCann, just sometimes here, sometimes there, it's not really a recurring theme, or it's not really a consistent theme, I should say. Recurring perhaps, but not consistent. And I was just like, I was under the impression that she died in the apartment. I would have taken that to the bank, that back in Praia de Luz, Portugal in 2007, that Madeleine McCann had been given sleep aid drugs by her parents, and that she had some type of adverse reaction where either the sleep aid drugs caused her to pass away, or perhaps she indeed got in some type of disoriented state, and then she climbed up onto the couch in their living room in the resort in Praia de Luz, fell forward and hit her head on a ledge. And I expanded upon some of these details because after just kind of going through the information very generally, I came across the Goncalo Amaral documentary. Goncalo Amaral, of course, being the lead detective in Portugal, the most famous detective in Portugal who has discussed the case of Madeleine McCann. At the time, you could see his documentary on YouTube, but, things always come up and they go down. And I was really going down that pathway when I was just like, it really seemed that Madeleine died in the apartment, and everything that I was thinking was put on screen in the Goncalo Amaral documentary. I never liked the guy. I thought there was something shady about him to begin with, but it appeared that that just seemed to answer all the questions, that some way, somehow, Madeleine passed away, and the parents first moved her body to a shelf in the bedroom, and then later on, they moved her body to a dump site, and perhaps 3 weeks later she was moved to a different dump site, and this would explain the cadaver dog searches. Okay? But then, as I learned more about the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, I began to just notice that Goncalo Amaral's explanations about how the accidental death theory could have occurred, or it could have genuinely been a murder theory. I mean, the parents could have been charged with murder if they gave their child sleep aid drugs that caused the disorientation or the death. I mean, that happens very frequently in parts of the world. I mean, all over the world, we should say. But one of the explanations that he would have provided for the cadaver dog hits is that Madeleine dies in the apartment. She climbs up onto the couch in her disoriented state, falls forward, hits her head on a ledge, and then she remained there for up to 1 hour, perhaps. And then once the parents learned, they moved her body to the shelf in the cupboard. Then, somewhere in Praia de Luz, this is Goncalo Amaral's theory, mind you, the body was kept in a freezer, maybe an industrial freezer, maybe a commercial freezer, but Madeleine's body was then kept in a freezer, and then when the parents got their rental car 3 weeks later, the body began to warm up as they were moving it to a different dump site, and that provided certain cadaver dog hits. So once you heard that, you'd think that her body was just somehow, some way kept in an industrial or commercial freezer. Who, what, when, where, why? How on earth would that have happened? So then, I guess you'd say it was at the very beginning of this year, or maybe around February, I heard the first ever live stream from the Stones Unturned podcast, Thomas Henry Horan, the gentleman that you heard speaking earlier, and he was talking about Madeleine McCann to start off that episode. And he was saying that Jerry is a liar, but Kate is not. And then I just thought, that's a bizarre thing to say. Jerry McCann, her father, is a liar, but Kate is not. And then he just began to give the explanation. It's like after I interviewed him about the Zodiac Killer and we talked about maybe having a Madeleine McCann interview in the future, what he was telling me was just kind of giving a little bit more of an explanation about that and saying that Kate McCann would not have known about what was going on. This was something that Jerry McCann would have planned in advance. And then the media ran wild. In short, that Jerry McCann wanted to sell Madeleine McCann on the dark web because he believed that Kate had had an affair, and to this group of Greco-Albanian, Roma, gypsies, for lack of a better term, who have this child trafficking network running through Europe. But the thing is, though, after they intercepted Madeleine McCann, it's like Jerry McCann called in the media and turned this into the most famous missing persons case in the world. And the thing that I heard in that first episode of The Stones Unturned that Thomas Horan said was that if you see these high-profile true crime cases that go unsolved, one of the biggest reasons why is that police, investigators, the bureaus, the different agencies do not want to jeopardize their own informants. And that is one of the things that happened with the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. That's why it was done in this particular way, or that's why they didn't arrest Jerry McCann for this crime, because he says very clearly on this season 2, episode 24 episode, that she would have been intercepted and they would have taken Jerry to jail as soon as they possibly could. But he called in the media and they simply did not intervene because they didn't want to jeopardize their confidential informants, their active informants. They didn't want to jeopardize the 8 convictions that they got out of Madeleine McCann being arrested. All I have to say about this now is just, well, let's wait and see. I mean, this upload is coming out in 2020, and in May of 2021, we will find out if Thomas Horan's theory is correct or not. And one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this tonight was that he says very clearly that he wants to share this idea. He wants to put this idea out there. And I thought, well, let's talk about it. I mean, if he has solved the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, perhaps the most famous missing persons case in the world, well, let's have a bit of a discussion about it and let's start to share the idea. But yes, indeed, Madeleine would have been moved to a variant of witness protection. And I mean, Thomas Horan says that he can even tell us where she is. Now, as far as some of the other theories in this case, I told you about how I thought that this was either an accidental death or a negligent homicide case on behalf of the parents. Jerry and Kate are both doctors, by the way. So, I mean, you want to think about some of that. Like, you could say that that's plausible or implausible. Actually, that could go either way. I told you about how, as we began to expand upon that I really began to believe that Madeleine McCann, was not killed because of sleep aid drugs, just because of how the after questions really led to somewhat of an implausible nature. But it is not crazy to suspect the parents of some type of foul play, because you heard very clearly there, he does indeed suspect Jerry McCann of foul play. It's just that you got to talk about the last people who were there to see her alive, and the whole thing about an individual named Matthew Oldfield came into the apartment 30 minutes before Madeleine was reported missing. He did one of the checks on her that the top of 7 were doing. And then he said that he saw the twins, but he wasn't really looking for Madeleine McCann. He was in the apartment. Everything seemed fine and quiet. That's the big thing that you'll see about Matthew Oldfield. Everything seemed fine and quiet. So he didn't get a good look at Madeleine. Well, then, it's not abnormal to suspect wrongdoing based on the parents. They were the last people to see her alive. I had just thought that Kate McCann was much guiltier than the Thomas Horan theory suggests, but according to him, she had no knowledge of this. She knew nothing about it. She has probably learned about it since and has been told to keep quiet. One of the pieces of evidence that Thomas Horan puts forward is that rewards were put out for Madeleine McCann, and Scotland Yard and Europol asked the people putting out those rewards to withdraw them, because they were like, we know where she is, we know what's going on, she's in a variant of witness protection. And a little bit of a background on Thomas Horan. Prior to becoming somewhat of a more famous writer for the Zodiac Killer hoax series, The Myth of the Zodiac Killer, he was an investigator dealing with people who fake their own deaths. He became a specialist in fraud investigation with people who fake their own deaths. So this is something that he says he knows how to do, and he knows how to find out where a person really ended up. And he said very frequently that when people go missing, they end up, when people go missing or there's this unsolved case, it's very frequently because police informants are involved. And the police departments do not want to jeopardize informants in this investigation or another investigation or something of that nature. He does say this very frequently. If you look at his stuff about the Great Zodiac Killer hoax, the word informants is just plastered all over that one, even saying that certain victims in the Zodiac case could have been informants for the narcotics division, or saying that the Zodiac case remains unsolved because of confidential informants or narcotics informants or some type of informants. It's the answer for everything. And sometimes when people really find a theory or a model that is very attractive to them, I'm just giving some type of counterbalance here, then they tend to go with that, and that just becomes the explanation for everything. I even got pulled into that for a while. What I used to think was about missing persons cases, like the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. It was as if somebody went missing. It just seemed like the most plausible theories were the ones that were involved with that person passing away very close to the time of their disappearance. Those are some of the biggest theories in the disappearance of Brandon Lawson, the disappearance of Maura Murray, the disappearance of Tara Calico. We could go on, because the person has passed away very close to the time of their disappearance. And these are still unsolved cases, every one that I've just mentioned, even Madeleine McCann. In short, the thing that Thomas Horan has been saying is this thing about a suspect in Germany and a murder theory. He's like media circus. One of the things, though, that I have not yet heard him explain, though, is, and this is just a thing, I don't even have an explanation for this, the cadaver dogs. All right, well, if that was faked by the media, then, well, how exactly did that happen? Dogs that are trained to attract the scent of a dead body or the scent of blood, Eddie and Keela, the most famous search dogs in the world, perhaps. as well as, I mean, just once again, like, we haven't really heard all of the steps, and he says he can't reveal everything until May of 2021. So if you're listening to this in the far, far off future, this might be old news, but until then, let's see what happens. And I would just be very curious what anyone would have to say about this being a sting operation. And when he says that the sting operation backfired, it means that they were able to intercept the person who was trying to abduct Madeleine McCann, but Jerry McCann called in the media and created the media circus, and then the police did not arrest him for this incident because they did not want to jeopardize certain parts of the investigation and the proceedings and trying to get these convictions and so on. What do you have to say about this? If you have anything that you would like to contribute about the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, even if you're someone who's very familiar with Thomas Horan's theory and you want to contribute that, I would love to hear. Or if you think that this is all completely wrong, please tell us why in the comments section below. Let's discuss a little bit more about the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. And that's all for me now. I would just like to say one more thing, though, that if you look in the description box, you will find a link to our first episode on the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, the response to the Netflix series. We did an 8-part response to the Netflix series, which is done in 8 parts. So we have an 8-part series on the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, and I would invite anyone to listen to that. That's not talking about the sting operation theory, talking about some other things if you'd like to hear more about that. That's all for me now, and I'll see you on Instagram for the bonus podcast. Until next time.